Good morning, colleagues. Good morning. Welcome. Would love to know where you're joining us from. If you can pop into the chat what organization you are at, which part of the world you're joining from, it will be great. Welcome to this month's webinar. I am Elizabeth Baini, Research Specialist at Ilifa Labantwana, and I'll be facilitating this morning's conversation. If you're new to this webinar, you're joining us for the first time, this is the Early Childhood Systems, Perspectives, and Research webinar series. It's a joint initiative of Ilifa Labantwana, our partners at Research on Social Economic Policy, RESEP at Stellenbosch University, and Data Drive 2030. Our aim is to explore the latest perspectives and research on issues affecting the early childhood development service delivery ecosystem and to create change for children through promotion of data and research. You are duly welcome and thank you for joining us this morning. Before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping. We've got a question and answer box down below. Through the presentation, if a question comes to mind or a comment, please pop it into the Q&A box. Alternatively, you'll get an opportunity at the end of the presentation to ask questions. So if you could raise your hand up and our technical team will unmute you when the time comes to ask your questions. All right. So this morning's conversation is pretty exciting because it's also coming right before a really important moment in the ECD calendar, which is the launch of the 2024 Thrive by 5 report or data. And obviously, from what we have seen from the 2021 Thrive by 5, we can all agree that South Africa is experiencing a learning crisis with significant number of children attending early learning programs not meeting key developmental milestones in areas such as emergent literacy, language, numeracy, and mathematics. So obviously, this shortfall is problematic because it really hinders or prevents their school readiness for formal schooling. And also, it has the long-term developmental impact. And today's presentation, we want to focus on whether or not socio-emotional skills like managing your emotions and building relationships really can play a role in helping children succeed in areas such as literacy and mathematics by the time they get to grade 2. And this morning, to help us to unpack some of these findings and move the conversation along, is a very exciting researcher from the Education Economics at RESEP at Stellenbosch University, Dr. Heleen Hofmeyr. Brief bio about her. Her work focuses on understanding and addressing socio-emotional, linguistic, and socioeconomic inequalities in early childhood development and learning. She also leads the Roots and Shoots study, which is a longitudinal project tracking school readiness and academic progress among young South African children. So it is with great pleasure that I present Dr. Heleen Hofmeyr to give us her presentation and talk us through whether or not school entry, socio-emotional skills, and early grade literacy and mathematics achievement, what the evidence from South Africa is showing us today. Over to you, Dr. Hofmeyr.
Thanks, Liz. Morning, everyone. Just going to share my screen so that you can all see my presentation. Sorry, just give me a sec. It always works in the tech check and then you struggle when we're live.
Not a problem.
Just give me a sec here. Sorry, Liz, it's the screen that I want to share is not coming up on my Zoom.
Okay, I will try and share on my side for you as
Yes,
well.
please. Thank you. Hold on. Something happened.
I think I'm sharing.
Oh, you're sharing.
Yes, if I'm
Okay,
not
cool.
mistaken.
Yes.
Uh,
Oh, I think I'm sharing. Okay. Are we all good? You can see my presentation?
yes,
Fantastic.
perfect.
Okay. Now we can get into it. It's always the technology always lets you down. But thank you, Elifa, Labantwana, for having me here. It's great to present these findings. The topic of today's conversation has already been introduced. So let's get into it. Before we do, funding acknowledgements. So this work was funded by the Partnership for Economic Policy, or PEP, in collaboration with the Global Education Analytics Institute, the GEAI, and an exciting new project called the African Fellows in Education program that I was part of, as well as the Mr. Price Foundation. If you're wondering what that QR code is on the cover page, that is a link to the actual paper. I know that this paper will be shared after this, but if you're super curious and you want to dive straight in while I'm talking, you can click on that or follow that QR code and you'll get to the paper. Right, so the word social, or the term socio-emotional skills, I think is quite a buzzword, and I think it's very important to acknowledge upfront that this is something that is spoken about a lot, but nobody is very clear on exactly what this means. And it's also spoken about by very different groups of people and experts. So I thought it would be good to upfront just acknowledge I would say the kind of four main groups of experts that tend to think about and write about these skills, being teachers, economists, pediatricians, and educational psychologists. So this truly is a multidisciplinary field of work. So what my word cloud there shows is the different terms that are often associated with, or the skills that are thought of when we think of socio-emotional skills. And the size of the word indicates how often it's used, and the colors indicate which group of experts uses that term. So for example, in yellow, we've got terms that are used across these four different groups of experts. And our biggest words here are attachment, empathy, and emotional intelligence. So across those four groups of experts, I think those terms are most commonly associated with socio-emotional skills. But it's important to note, teachers' words here are indicated in blue. So things like self-control, attention span, are what comes up for teachers. And then, of course, the other side of it is what's lacking when there are no socio-emotional skills. So disruptive behavior, emotional outbursts. In green, we've got economists. We like very technical terms, so things like self-efficacy, delay of gratification, risk aversion. Pediatricians also talk about socio-emotional skills. There, it's largely about screening, developmental screening. The word temperament comes up a lot. And then in red, we've got educational psychologists who, of course, this is kind of their bread and butter. And the words there, things around classroom engagement, coping skills, internalizing behavior. So before we jump into it, I thought let's get the definitions out the way, and acknowledge that this broad concept of socio-emotional skills is treated differently across different disciplines. And I'm not here to say one is right or more correct than the other. I think the important thing to acknowledge up front is that the insight probably comes from bringing together these different perspectives. So that's the broad picture. But for today, let's hone in on my definition that I'm going to be using. I'd like to start off with the definition so that you've got in your mind what am I actually talking about when I'm going to present my results. So my definition is based on the data that I'm using to investigate this question, which was the ELOM 4 and 5 social and emotional functioning scale. I'm sure everyone in this room is very familiar with the ELOM, but just to emphasize, so there's two parts of this scale. The first part is to do with social functioning. So that's all about, can children play cooperatively with their peers? So there's this peer dimension, and then importantly, can they form relationships with and appropriately interact with adults? So that's the social part. And then there's the emotional part, which is emotional readiness for school. And in ELOM 4 and 5, they define this as the child has the age-appropriate resources to manage formal learning environments. So I think very broadly, it's important to kind of start off with the logic of why we're looking at this. Why this research question? Why do we expect socio-emotional skills to matter for school success? Well, this literature shows that learners with better socio-emotional skills are able to form stronger relationship with their teachers, which in turn results in them receiving more support and encouragement from their teachers. In very economist terms, higher investment from their teachers. These learners are also able to form more supportive relationship with their peers, which helps with general school engagement. And better socio-emotional skills are also associated with being better able to avoid distractions and persist in difficult tasks. So this is the kind of theory of why we might expect that these skills matter for academic achievement. So the gap that I'm trying to fill with this work is that we have this evidence base that's quite voluminous, but as is the case with a lot of studies in the kind of development space, most of the evidence comes from high-income countries. So that's the first thing. And secondly, it's concentrated around older learners. So learners already in school, in primary school, in high school. So the question that I really want to seek to answer in this paper is, do these skills matter for younger children and in South African classrooms? So let's dive into my sample. I made use of data from the Roots and Shoots study, which was mentioned in my introduction. So in this study, it's the first longitudinal study we have where we're following learners all the way from the start of grade R into grade 2. In this study, I make use of the first 3 waves. We're actually in field right now as we speak, collecting data for the 4th and final wave. But this makes use of the first 3 waves of data. So in grade R, there were 556 learners who were assessed using the ELOM 4 and 5 in 2022. This was at the beginning in the first term of grade R. And then those same learners were assessed again in wave 2 when they were at the start of grade 1 using the ELOM R. Sorry, I keep forgetting it used to be ELOM 6 and 7, but the ELOM R. And then the third wave was when the learners were in grade 2 and they were assessed in literacy and mathematics skills using the EGRA and EGMA assessments. So these learners, the 400 that I'm going to be looking at who were assessed in all 3 waves, are spread across 75 schools around in Cape Town and also around the broader Cape Town region, all the way up to Paarl and Worcester. And then just some basic kind of summary statistics about the data to give you an idea of the context that we're looking at. So the vast majority of schools in this sample, 71%, are no-fee schools. Half of the children in the data are social grant recipients, so really kind of socioeconomically disadvantaged. In terms of language, we've got 1/3 isiXhosa and 2/3 Afrikaans learners. At the start of the study, on average, they were, the correct age for grade R, which is around 5.5 years. And we have a good equal split in terms of boys and girls in the sample. In terms of the instruments that are used, so I already explained that I used this ELOM social and emotional functioning scale, but I think it's good to keep in mind exactly how this measure was collected, how this data was collected. So I spoke about part one, the social relations with peers and adults. Now this part of the ELOM tool is administered to an adult who knows the child well. In our case, we asked the teacher of the learner this set of questions about the child's social and emotional functioning. So in terms of the social relations with peers and adults, this is all about, can the child work cooperatively with their peers? There's a focus on turn-taking, managing impulsivity. And then there's the adult part, which is, does the child seek assistance from familiar adults? Do they seek explanations from familiar adults? So that's the one part of the scale. And the questions that make up the second part of the scale, as I mentioned, was about emotional readiness for school. So here, it's about the appropriate expression of feelings, and that's a big one, but also managing change in routine in the classroom or at home, their approach to new experiences, their confidence. So those questions were administered to the teachers, and then I create an index of this of these 12 items that make up the scale to come up with an overall kind of average socio-emotional functioning score. My literacy and maths measures, as I mentioned, comes from the EGRA and the EGMA. So for those of you who don't know, the EGRA and EGMA are kind of very standard tools that are used to measure literacy and maths in the early grades. The typical tasks that are administered. So for the EGRA, this is a one-on-one assessment with the learner, where a field worker sits with one-on-one with a child. So it's not written, it's a verbal assessment. The tasks are letter sound recognition, phonemic awareness, syllable reading, word reading, passage reading, which is also called oral reading fluency. There's a reading comprehension and a listening comprehension. And then the EGMA, the maths test, was administered in a written format. So learners were put in, the sampled learners were put in a classroom, and they were led through a written test. So it's not like they sat and just had to write it. They were kind of paced through every single one of the tasks, which were about number concept, addition of numbers, single digit and double digit, pattern recognition, and word sums. So these are kind of the standard in our field way of measuring if children, these are the skills they're supposed to, at grade 2 level, be able to do. I calculated scores on each of the measures by standardizing across each task and then calculating an average score. So each learner has an average socio-emotional skills score, as well as an average EGRA reading score and average math score. So at the very start, the first thing you do when you embark on this is you make a scatter plot and see, is there even an association? So without controlling for anything, these graphs just show the raw association between socio-emotional skills, which are plotted on the x-axis, and literacy on the left-hand side and maths on the right-hand side. And what this really is just showing that we see a strong positive association between these skills and grade 2 literacy and maths achievement. So that's a good first step. Are the raw scores associated? But of course, that doesn't mean that these skills cause a learner to perform better in maths and literacy. There could be many confounding factors. It could be, a high ability student could have both high socio-emotional skills and high literacy scores. So the socio-emotional skills didn't cause the literacy score. They were just kind of occurring together. So what do we do to kind of tease this out a little bit more? I then go on and control for factors that typically you would expect would confound this relationship. So we control for age and gender, for socioeconomic status, and school fee status. And the third one that I've listed there, I think, is almost really one of the most important ones, is I also control for school entry cognitive skills. So the ELOM, being the wonderful detailed instrument that it is, with its 5 domains that it assesses, we could use 3 of the domains to create a score of cognitive skills at the start of grade R. So the ELOM domains that I used or looked at was the cognition and executive function, emergent language and literacy, and emergent numeracy and mathematics. Sorry, it's missing there, but and mathematics. So when I say I control for this, I can basically tease out the effect or the association of socio-emotional skills, even when accounting for differences in cognitive skills. So I know that not everyone may be familiar with the idea of what does it mean to control for something. So just to summarize, what this really means is if you compared two learners with the same age, gender, socioeconomic status, school entry cognitive skills, and even within the same school, so two learners who are exactly the same in all of those dimensions, the one with the better socio-emotional skills at the start of grade R will perform better in literacy and maths in grade 2. So this really, especially the fact that we can control for school entry cognitive skills. So we control for, these are learners who are scoring the same early language and literacy, the same early numeracy and mathematics, the same executive function and cognition. If we can even keep that the same, 2 years later, the one with better socio-emotional skills did better in both literacy and maths, which I think is kind of the most significant result for me from this. If we talk about, what is the magnitude of this association? Is it tiny? Is it meaningful? I think the best way to think about it is if we had a class of 20 learners and we ranked them in terms of their performance. So what my result shows that if you took a child who was at the exact midpoint of that class of 20 learners, so median, and you managed to improve their socio-emotional skills so much so that they jumped 5 positions in the ranking, then their literacy and math skills would increase, their ranking would increase by 2 learners. So it's not a one-for-one association, but that would be quite amazing if that was the case. So it's smaller than 1-for-1, but it's still showing that this is quite significant. Increasing in rank by 5 learners in social-emotional skills with their increased rank in academic skills by 2 learners. So the next thing I look at is, do we see any evidence of differential impact of different by different dimensions? So the first one I look at is gender. And I think for me, this is one of the most interesting results of the paper. I've also done some work on gender differences, particularly the pro-girl gap. So basically what I do is I estimate the same relationship, but I split my sample into boys and girls and just separately estimate the association for boys and for girls. Now, what I'm showing you here is the size of the coefficient on socio-emotional skills. So I'm controlling for all those things that I mentioned that we control for. So we take out socioeconomic status, we take out school entry cognitive skills, age, school fee status, and we just say, okay, let's try and isolate the association between socio-emotional skills. And boys here are shown in the little blue dots. I think it's striking that the coefficient for boys for literacy is so much larger than for girls. Now, if you're wondering what those lines are, those are 95% confidence intervals. So that really is an indication of how precise are we with our estimate. How much, with how much confidence can we say that that is definitely the size of that effect? And I've got the 0 line is in red because if the 95% confidence interval overlaps with 0, then it's a null effect. Then we can't exclude the possibility that there may be no effect. So really what the graph on the left is showing us that this association is much, much stronger for boys than for girls, so much so that the association between girls' socio-emotional skills and their later outcome, literacy and math, or just literacy outcomes, is actually not statistically significant. It's just significant for boys. And we see a similar effect with maths, not as pronounced, but there's definitely this gender dimension where boys have this much stronger association. So I dove into this a little bit. It seems to me that the main explanation or preliminary explanation is that boys had lower socio-emotional skills at baseline, so in wave 1. they, on average, their socio-emotional skills were about a third of a standard deviation lower than girls. So that's very big. So what this suggests is that socio-emotional skills matter more at lower levels. So I think the way to practically think about this is if you have a boy, in my sample, the boys have lower socio-emotional skills. So if you compare a boy who has real problems with self-regulation, with impulsivity, can't concentrate, right? So really struggling with socio-emotional skills. Compare that to a boy who is fairly okay in terms of their self-regulation and ability to control their impulses and so on. You're going to see a large effect on the academic outcomes, but comparing those two boys, because we're comparing a boy who's really struggling with social-emotional skills with one who's kind of okay. But because girls are on average doing better, what you're really doing in my sample is you're comparing a girl who has fairly well-developed social-emotional skills with a girl who has excellent socio-emotional skills. So this is very preliminary still, but it seems to say that really these skills matter more at the lower end. And I think that intuitively makes sense, right? That there's a larger gain to be made from going from really struggling to pay attention, being very disruptive, to being able to sit and concentrate. There's a larger gain there than being able to sit and control impulsivity, to being extremely studious. So yeah, I think that's what that result says. But as I say, it's very preliminary, and I think this is something we need to look at when we think about the pro-girl gap in South Africa for sure. I also estimate differential effects by school fee status. So here I split my sample into no fee and fee charging schools. The thinking here is there's this wonderful article by an American, David Yeager, who says socio-emotional skills are not magic. And he basically makes this point that, at the time, everyone is so excited about socio-emotional skills and let's just focus on these skills. And he says these skills are not going to be conducive to learning if the environment in which the child is. So that they're kind of a foundation to build learning on. But if you only have the foundation without additional inputs like high quality instruction, resources in the school, then that foundation is not going to help you perform better later. So that's the thinking behind it. As you can see, these 95% confidence intervals overlap, so we can't say that these effects are really different from each other. However, there is, to me, I look at this and I do see a larger effect for fee charging schools than for no fee schools. So what this really is saying is that two children with the same level of socio-emotional skills, the one who's in the fee charging school is going to benefit more from their socio-emotional skills than the child who is in the no fee school. So this does provide preliminary evidence that socio-emotional skills are not enough, that the quality of the school also is going to matter in how productive those socio-emotional skills are going to be later on. I then also do a kind of similar reasoning, but instead of looking at school fee status, I look at the socioeconomic status of the child at home. Similar results, we start to see a bit of a pattern, but again, so where poorer learners have a smaller association than wealthier learners. But as I said, those confidence intervals are overlapping, so it's very preliminary at this stage. Then this finding, which I really would like to draw attention to, I look at differential effects by school entry cognitive skills. So the outcomes, the early numeracy and mathematics, early language and literacy, executive function, and cognition. And I break up the sample into 3 groups based on how well they scored on those cognitive domains, and then estimate my association separately for each group. And basically what this graph is showing us, we can see this clear pattern that for higher levels of cognitive skills are associated with a stronger association between socio-emotional skills and literacy and maths. So this suggests that, and it kind of speaks to the scaffolding and the multiplicity and the nature of skills, is that they build on each other, and that again, it's emphasizing that the socio-emotional skills are not enough. If a child comes in and they're very well developed socio-emotionally, but they have very low cognitive skills, do not have a good emergent literacy and numeracy, for example, then those socio-emotional skills are not going to be as productive as if that child already has a strong foundational base of cognitive skills. So, what are the practical implications? That's what everyone in the room wants to know, right? What do we do with this? So I thought that I would highlight an example from the international literature. I chose the PATHS curriculum because I think that's the most kind of convincing evidence that I've seen, and the most recent evidence. So there's this program called Promoting Alternative Thinking Strategies. It is a socio-emotional skills intervention that's aimed at kind of improving these 4 dimensions of a child's development: self-control and patience, decision-making and social problem-solving, emotional intelligence, and self-esteem. So there's also some examples of the activities that are aimed at fostering each of those different types of skills. And what's exciting about PATHS is it was conducted in Switzerland 15 years ago. And there's a paper just this year published of an evaluation of the PATHS program, which was an RCT. So what it looked like, teachers had training for 3 days, just a 3-day workshop, but then they had ongoing coaching support. So a coach who would come to them once a month and observe their lessons and guide them. They held one 30-minute PATHS lesson per week for grade 2 learners for a year, for 1 year, for the grade 2 year. Because it's Switzerland, they have insane data. So the authors of this paper were able to follow the learners who were in the PATHS intervention 15 years ago and show that 15 years after being in that program in grade 2, the learners who had been in the program were more likely to be enrolled in or have graduated from university. So I just find this absolutely mind-blowing to think that a 30-minute socio-emotional skills lesson once a week for a year in grade 2 affected university outcomes 15 years later. So yeah, this is really powerful. However, I think it's important that we pause, and this is major caution that I want to exercise. The evidence that we have from Brazil, they had a program called Programa Compasso, the evidence presented by Dana McCoy and colleagues. And this was a socio-emotional skills intervention that was done in all primary schools in Rio. So the ministry really got on board and they said, we're going to go, and they rolled out this whole citywide level of a socio-emotional skills intervention. The intervention was based on a program that was developed in the US, which was called Second Step. So they kind of altered it and adapted it for the Brazilian context. However, sadly, they find that the program had negative effects on children's behavioral problems, their ability to recognize emotion, and their working memory, which was really unexpected. If you have a null effect, that's one thing. But if you find that your intervention actually worsened those outcomes, I think that's extremely surprising. And what they in the paper provide as potential explanations for why they see these negative effects is the typical implementation issues, time and resource constraints. There were ad hoc modifications of the program content by teachers. But for me, the thing that is really important to take from the Brazilian case is the potential cultural mismatch that there was between the content of this program and the context in which it was being implemented. So even though they made efforts to adapt the program, the Second Step program from the US, there were still serious question marks about, they did interviews with teachers afterwards to try and understand qualitatively why did they see these negative results. And many of the teachers said, this is the content of this is not appropriate for our children. And this was different even at the neighborhood level. I think Brazil is very similar to us in that there's a lot of inequality and cultural differences geographically. And they found that especially in high violence neighborhoods, the skills that they were trying to teach the learners, the way that they were trying to teach the learners to express their emotions were perceived as not appropriate for that context. So that's very important to keep in mind. You know, it's exciting to see this evidence from Switzerland and to just want to say, let's take paths, for example, and bring it to South Africa. But I think the caution really lies in this Brazilian case, where it's really clear you cannot just take a program, especially when it comes to socio-emotional skills. You know, literacy and maths, you know, that's not really a context-dependent skill. But the ability to recognize emotion or appropriately express emotion, that is extremely culturally sensitive. That's just, I think, very important to keep in mind here. So, summary of my findings and some implications. So just to summarize why this work is relevant, it is the first local longitudinal evidence that we have of a strong association between socio-emotional skills at the start of school and academic achievement in grade 2. Implications-wise, I think this makes it so clear that there is a strong need to foster socio-emotional skills in early learning programs. And yeah, I think there's a lot of uncertainty around what that could look like, whether it's a designated, you know, half an hour a day that the teacher specifically focuses on socio-emotional skills, or whether practices are embedded in the rest of the practice. But I think it's also an exciting moment as focus is now, and the minister keeps saying early learning, early learning, early learning. This is an exciting moment to say, okay, what is, and I don't want to really call it a curriculum. You know, I don't know if early learning should be called a curriculum, but what are the practices that teachers should be doing with learners in early learning programs? And I think this evidence makes it very clear that the socio-emotional part should be part of that. And it's, you know, one argument usually is yes, because children need socio-emotional development, and that's, you know, they have to be holistic. And I think what my paper shows is these skills matter even for academic achievement, for literacy and maths. It's not that we should think about these things separately. You know, socio-emotional skills really are kind of the foundation of the academic skills. But then lastly, very important to keep in mind is that when we design what this should look like in early learning programs, we should be very mindful of having locally developed practices that are contextually appropriate. So thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Heleen. Sure. That was, maybe I could start off with the compliments. Thank you for making the technical, sometimes, you know, often dense, you know, research accessible and easy to follow. I quite enjoyed that. And perhaps to also echo Kensani's comment is that it's a really interesting and great use of the instruments, and it's a great flow of children's development. So I suppose we start high with the compliments before we get bogged down with the nitty-gritties of questions. Why didn't you do this? How can we do it better? Thank you. That was very enjoyable and great research. I also looked at the paper. I quite enjoyed it as well. And perhaps I'm preempting like follow up later with the new release of important index coming as well. So we'll see where that goes. But perhaps we'll kick off with a question from Nicholas. And I guess the curiosity is why you didn't include such important, you know, skills like fine motor and visual skills integrated into it as a control variable. So perhaps if you can briefly talk through your thinking with us again and why you limited it to those two specific skills, literacy and maths.
Yes. So that's a very good question. Nobody's ever asked me that. I think the choice of how you conceptualize these things is very often driven by the discipline that you're in, right? And I think in economics, we have this we split cognitive skills and non-cognitive skills. And so when we talk about cognitive skills, we control non-cognitive skills. That's what we call them. Crazy. I prefer socio-emotional skills. We control for cognitive skills. So the domain of fine motor and visual integration to me couldn't really be called a cognitive skill. And the same with gross motor. So it was difficult to say, okay, and this is why we control for this. So basically, the short answer is really just that's not usually what's done in the economics literature, but it's a really good point that maybe I should include that and see what that does to my results. Yeah.
Okay, great. I wonder if Jill Nasser would like to ask her question. She's got Jill, if you can raise your hand and they will give you access to speak. Oh, there we are. Can we take the floor, Jill? Thank you.
Okay, sorry. I've wonderful research. I love it, but I'm really worried at the moment about pedagogical practices in the country. I'm just saying this is my big concern. So my questions are actually from a pedagogical perspective. And the first one is we always acknowledge that girls' social emotional development at age 4, 5, and 6 is way ahead of the boys' social emotional development. And this is quite normative. So this question is, was this taken into consideration in the research? I don't know that. My next one is about Erikson's stages of emotional development, because there are seven stages, and what we're finding is that children maybe from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are reaching the next stage at a later age than children from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. And then what we're also beginning to see is I can't find anybody in this country, and I can't find any preschool teacher or ECD practitioner, educator. When I do workshops, I ask them, is anybody in this room not being subjected to some sort of criminal activity, even if it's just theft of a cell phone? Not one of them can put their hands up. So we're actually dealing with a deep trauma base in our ECD practitioners across social economic classes. You know, it doesn't matter whether you're wealthy or poor. So how can people who are traumatized actually improve other people's socio-economic development? And have there been any studies on trauma management of trauma in preschool educators? That's what I'm also looking for, because we're seeing that more. Sorry, I'm over. It's a lot.
Thank you, Jill. I think thank you very much, Jill, for your questions. I think what Jill is also alluding to perhaps is the role that the home context also provides in what we are seeing in your results. So if you could help us unpack some of these within your expertise, I guess. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you for specifying within my expertise, right? I'm not a developmental psychologist or a sociologist for that matter. But okay, I will speak to the home context thing in a bit. But to answer Joel's questions about girls' socio-emotional skills, yeah, absolutely. I think it wasn't explicitly taken into account at the beginning of the study, that the fact that girls have faster, I guess, socio-emotional development than boys. But I hope that what I end up doing in the paper is showing this local evidence that is the case. And yeah, just bringing that evidence into the public discourse around why girls are doing better academically, and really showing, I think what's encouraging about my results is that, okay, yes, so boys have worse socio-emotional skills, but the effect of socio-emotional skills on boys' academic achievement was so much higher. So that to me suggests if we invest in boys' socio-emotional skills, well, in all learners' socio-emotional skills, boys are going to be the ones who benefit particularly, which is an encouraging result. The question about the stages of emotional development, I'm not familiar with that framework, but it's interesting, the question around SES and socio-emotional skills, because in my data, and it's the same in the national Thrive by 5 data, we don't actually see a socio-economic gradient to socio-emotional skills. So we don't actually see this lower socio-emotional skills among more disadvantaged learners. So maybe that's something that needs to be interrogated more, but the data definitely doesn't show that gradient. Yeah, the question around trauma and ECD practitioners, the idea that how do we expect these practitioners to be responsive caretakers and educators when they themselves are in a sense traumatized. I haven't looked at that, but I think it's a very relevant question to be asking in the South African context. And then Liz, your comment about thinking how these things interact with the home context. Yeah, I think it's a question of, what is exactly the research question you want to answer? And are you focusing on the home context, or are you kind of controlling for it so that you can identify an effect? In this case, I control for socioeconomic status so that we can get a clear idea of this association. But I definitely agree that, yeah, we should be thinking about how these things interact and how social-emotional skills are developed at home. It's that classic thing of, even if all children are in school and all children are in early learning programs, that's the minority of the number of hours that they're awake, right? The rest of the time, their development is happening at home or in their communities. So definitely important to look at that. Yeah.
Yes, sure. And I was merely alluding to the fact that ECD programs are not insulated from the broader community context. And just to make the point Jill was trying to unpack about trauma and having to. All right, I think, and you have also in a way answered the question of what makes the greatest difference, right? Is it the fee paying, like the better resource schools, or the teacher? And to some degree, they all have a role to play, but if I'm hearing you correctly, the pedagogical aspect, the teacher aspect is stronger than the socioeconomic context that the child finds himself in, right?
I can't answer that from my study. I don't compare that. Yeah, unfortunately.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay, if we could get Chantal to ask her question. She has a specific question around the socio-emotional interventions that you've presented. Chantal, over to you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. So my question is really around, do we know what are the interventions or the practices that build the socio-emotional competencies? And if so, do we know when these practices should be instituted or applied within the context of childhood? Is it infant level, ECD level, preschool level, or building it at school? Thank you so much, Liz, for the opportunity.
You're welcome. Over to you, Dr. Hofmeyr.
Yes. So, I mean, the field of socio-emotional interventions has boomed in the last 10 years. It's at the point where there's like meta-analyses of 120 interventions. So this really has become a massive kind of effort towards implementing such interventions all over the world. I think the consensus is that, and I think this just makes sense, these the activities and the things that you do have to be developmentally appropriate. And this is the importance of bringing in developmental psychologists, psychiatrists, even specialists who can tell you, at this age, a child is supposed to be able to do this, and this is the activity that is used or that can foster that skill. So this, it's definitely something that has to be informed by the science. And what's exciting is that our recent advantages in neuroscience, and especially the developing brain, give us the evidence that we need to be able to say, okay, these are the exact activities that you need to do. So, but in terms of when, so it's not the case that you can just take one activity and apply it wherever the child is in their development. It's very, very specific at different developmental stages,
All right. I think that also addresses Dorot's question around indication of what helps preschool children build socio-emotional skills. So it's not a one size fits all. It needs to be tailored to some degree to the child's context, and it needs to be expert or designed with intention. I'm hearing you say. So there's a question, and I wonder, so obviously you focus specifically on South Africa, but I mean, learning is learning, right? So to what degree are these findings perhaps replicable in other contexts, especially in the Southern African region, keeping in mind that context also matters, as you appropriately pointed out that it needs to be locally and contextually designed or thought through. So if someone, say in Zambia or Zimbabwe, is looking at this, what are some of the advice, I suppose, or is this a useful way to look at it in other areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. And I think, in response, highlight a study that was done in Tanzania, where it was done by USAID, Matthew Jukes and colleagues. The title of the paper is "Respect is an Investment." And what they did is they qualitatively went into communities and asked the community's members, leaders, parents, and teachers, what do you think are the socio-emotional skills that children need to succeed in school and in life? And what came out there very strongly was this, I think, you don't want to broadly generalize, but in African context, communality, and collaboration and respect was emphasized way above things like independence. And so I think the Tanzanian study is a really good example of how to do this. And it really is about being informed by the local context and not making assumptions about what is happening in a specific context, but going out and hearing the voices of people in the context where they are situated. Yeah.
Great. Just for clarity's sake, there was no intervention over the 2-year period, right? So how can you account for the change in socio-emotional skills over time, or are they merely on track with developmental norms? Just to be clear.
Yeah, so no, there wasn't an intervention. This was just following children business as usual. We can account for changes in socio-emotional skills, and maybe that's something worth doing. But for me, the interesting question that I wanted to place out there in the world is, at the start of school entry, the socio-emotional skills that you have there, is that predictive of your later outcomes? Because there's this debate, and our current policy space is, what should children be learning in early learning programming? Should they be sitting and counting and learning the alphabet already, or what should the programs look like? So for me, yes, of course, we can bring in the development of social-emotional skills over time, but my research question really was, if you look at the social-emotional skills that a child has when they start grade R, does that actually predict their later outcomes?
Okay, great. So the Tanzanian study you mentioned is piquing interest. perhaps you could share that with us, and then we will include it in the post-webinar communication. There's a question here about what age was the Brazilian program implemented? So the age group that the program targeted.
Yeah, I think it was also in the foundation phase, either grade 2 or grade 3. I'm not 100% sure, but I can share that as well if people are interested.
Okay, great. This is a really engaging topic because there's lots of comments and questions. So we'll try and get through as much as possible. Karen says she's looking at this from an intervention perspective, right? So is it fair to say that these findings tell us that we could have better results if we implement maths and language programs in grade R together with socio-emotional programs?
That is what my study says. Absolutely. That is what my evidence says. Yes.
Right on the money. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
John Fish Hodgins has a specific question. I wonder if he can raise his hand and we'll give him the opportunity to ask as the last question for you. It's very interesting conversations and study that you have presented, and it's getting a lot of. Over to you, John.
Thanks, and thank you, Heleen. Wondering if your paper relates your work, your very interesting work, to Dana McCoy and I's work on fold skills, partly in terms of how they're conceptualizing those and some of the conversation, which argues for a wider understanding of some of these socio-emotional skills and also sort of culturally specific, like you said. But secondly, what they point to in terms of the growing body of evidence about the role of play and relationships, which I'm sure are things that you could say some more about. So broadly wondering about whether you're engaging with that particular recent work, but the issues raised. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, John, for that. The whole time while we were talking, I was like, I need to find a way to say something about play. So thank you for that question, because I really think that is one of the, as this literature is like so fast developing, that one of the benefits of play is exactly that it develops the socio-emotional skills in children in a way that, you know, sitting down in class and reading or doing activities is never going to do. And I'm particularly interested in not in the free play, right? So not this kind of telling a child exactly what to do, you know, build this Lego with this is what it should look like at the end, but just, you know, kind of letting children figure stuff out for themselves, and how important that is for their development, especially socially, engaging with peers. I think relating this to the play literature, that to me comes out, is how important it is to develop sharing and turn taking, and that's all part of play. The fold skills, I have to admit that doesn't ring a bell. Maybe the acronym is just eluding me, but I'll definitely look it up. Sounds interesting.
Fantastic. And one last one from our end. So someone is asking, were you able to identify specific program components from the roots and shoots that develop socio-emotional learning? The idea is that it is obviously important to start understanding both what mediates the learning and how we assess it, right? So I wonder if you can briefly say something on that. If there's nothing, it's also great. This has been very, very eye-opening.
So just to be clear, Roots and Shoots was not an intervention, right? It's just a longitudinal study. So yeah, in terms of identifying program components, this is not a case where we're going, did an intervention raise socio-emotional skills? This was purely just a observational study looking at how it is. But there's definitely, I hope that everyone in the room is perking up and going, this is an opportunity to start evaluating whether our programs actually improve socio-emotional skills. And since we are at time, I just like to say something that I really want to emphasize with this work. Of course, you know, we know foundational literacy and maths is incredibly important. Those foundational skills are what you need to go further. But I also don't want to take away the fact that socio-emotional skills are also important in and of themselves. And that's increasingly becoming the case, right? Like as the world is changing, as the whole nature of education and careers and jobs are changing, everything that I see is pointing towards socio-emotional skills just becoming more and more important. So the way I see this evidence is showing, yeah, absolutely, they're actually very important for reading and maths as well. But then you have this added thing that I think is important to keep in mind, that they're important in and of themselves as well.
Thank you so much. All right. I froze there for a moment. I wasn't sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Heleen, for such a powerful presentation. And I suppose for me, the take-home message is that we do have an early learning crisis, but there's also roots and shoots, right? There are positives coming out of it, and that educators are working, things are happening. It might take longer than we want, but we are going to see results in the long run if we are persistent in the interventions that we are applying currently. Thank you for your time, for joining us this morning. Just a quick announcement. Next month, we'll be on sabbatical because the 2024 Thrive by 5 Index will be launched. It's going to be a very busy month for us, and everything to do with where we are in learning outcomes, unpacking the results of the report. So thank you for all who joined us, and I wish you well. Have a good afternoon.